6 men came with shovels to bury a woman the town had decided was dead. Only one person refused to believe them. A 10-year-old boy who had lain beside her all night, his ear pressed to her chest, listening to a heart the world had already written off. "Please," he said, "she's still warm." He was right, and the stranger who stopped to check a man with gray eyes and a worn wedding ring and 3 years of unfinished business would discover that the woman in that road was carrying something far more dangerous than anyone knew. This is the story of what happened next. The ground was already beginning to freeze. It happened every October in Dustfall, Wyoming. The soil that had spent all summer soaking up sun and horse sweat and the hard labor of men who worked, it would begin slowly and without ceremony to harden. The top inch went first, then the second, then the third, until by the end of the month you could drive a pickaxe into the earth and feel the resistance travel up through your arms and into your shoulders, and like the ground itself was telling you enough. Nothing more goes in, nothing more comes out. 6 men stood in the road that morning with that knowledge pressing down on them. The road was the main one leading into Dustfall from the east, and a wide dirt track that turned red in the dry months and brown and sticky in the wet ones. At this hour, just past sunrise, the sagebrush on either side still held the night's cold, and the mist that settled low over the valley floor had not yet decided whether to lift or stay. The sky above was pale gray at its edges and deep blue at its center, the kind of sky that promises nothing. The 6 men had shovels. One of them had already begun digging. The hole was not deep, 3 feet perhaps a little more, deep enough to matter. The man who had done the digging was named Warren Mills, a carpenter by trade, a decent man by habit, and a troubled man by circumstance. He had set his shovel aside when the man would not move, and now he stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the ground, looking at the boy, looking anywhere that was not at the woman lying in the road. She was lying on her back, her arms loose at her sides, her face turned slightly to the left as if she were simply resting and had found a comfortable position for her head. Her hair, dark brown with the first hints of something lighter, threading through it at the temples, had spread out around her on the red dirt and caught small pieces of grit and dry grass in its length. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, or had been once before the road had gotten to it. One shoulder was torn. Both her hands, even in stillness, even in what appeared to be the absolute rest of a person who would never again need to pick up anything or hold anything, still showed the evidence of a working life. The knuckles were wide. The palms, though they lay open and upward, carried the calluses of someone who had made things and moved things and refused to stop long after most people would have sat down. She was 32 years old. She did not look it. She looked younger in the strange mercy that unconsciousness can sometimes give a face, smoothing the lines that worry and grief and long travel carve into a person's skin. She was not dead, but no one standing in that road knew that yet, except for one person. The boy was 10 years old. His name was Thomas Webb, and he was lying across his mother's body with his arms wrapped around her and his face pressed into her shoulder, and he was not going to move. This was not a decision he had made in any conscious way. It was something older than decision, something that operated below the level of thought in the same region where breathing happens and the heart continues its business without being asked. He was not going to move because something in him, something that had been listening all night while the men of Dustfall slept in their beds, knew a thing that could not be argued with. She was warm. Not the warmth of sunlight on skin, not the warmth of a fire's proximity, the warmth of a living body of blood, still moving through its work of a heart still going about its business quietly and with great effort in the dark of a chest that the world had already written off. Thomas had lain beside her all night. He had pressed his ear to her chest and listened to that heart, that stubborn and incredible heart, doing what it had always done. He had felt the faint rise and fall of her breathing, shallow as creek water in a dry summer, but present, still there. He had held her hand and felt, if he held very still and paid very close attention, the distant pulse in her wrist like a message being sent from somewhere far away. She was alive. He knew it the way he knew his own name. "Son," Warren Mills said. He said it gently, the way a man speaks to someone he genuinely does not want to hurt. "Son, you need to let us do what we came to do." Thomas did not respond. "We have to do this before the ground gets any harder," one of the other men said less gently. This was a man named Pete Coker who worked the land north of town and had strong opinions about efficiency and not much patience for anything that slowed it down. Another 2 days and we won't be able to get her in proper. Thomas still did not respond. Please don't bury her, he said. His voice was quiet and even and completely certain. She's still warm. The men looked at one another over the boy's back. Warren Mills rubbed the side of his face. Pete Coker exhaled through his nose. The other four men found things to look at that were not the woman or the boy. Bodies stay warm for a while after, Warren said. He hated saying it. He said it anyway because he believed it was the true thing and therefore the merciful thing, however much it did not feel that way. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, Thomas. The warmth. She was talking to me, Thomas said. No one spoke. Just a little while ago, before I fell asleep, she told me to stay close to her. The morning held still around those words. The mist sat where it was. The sagebrush did not move. Even Pete Coker, who had little patience and stronger opinions, did not say anything for a long moment. I know she was, Warren said finally, and his voice had changed. There was something waterlogged in it now. I know she was son. He reached down and put his hand on Thomas's shoulder, meaning to lift him gently, meaning to be as careful as a man could be, meaning to do this terrible and necessary thing with as much kindness as the situation allowed. Thomas held on tighter. Please, he said again, not louder, just with more of himself behind it. Every ounce of certainty a 10-year-old boy carries in his body channeled into a single word. Please don't bury her, she's still warm. And that was when the sound came from the road. Not a shout, not a question, not even a word. Just the sound of boots on packed dirt, heavy and unhurried, each step deliberate in the way that some men's steps are deliberate when they have learned through long experience to move through the world without wasting motion. The sound came closer and then it stopped. Thomas lifted his face from his mother's shoulder. He did not know who he expected to see. He did not know what he was hoping for. He was 10 years old and he had been awake all night, and the world had narrowed down to the size of the space between himself and his mother, and the terrible fact of the hole in the ground. The man standing in the road was not tall in any exceptional way, and not broad in any exceptional way, and if you passed him on a street in a city somewhere, you might not look twice. He had the kind of face that had been made by weather more than by years tanned unevenly, the way men get tanned when they spend most of their time outside, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting at distances. His hair was the color of river mud, going gray at the sides. He wore a duster that had seen considerable use and boots that had seen more. He was, Thomas would later think, the stillest person he had ever seen. Not still like a statue is still. Still like a man who had decided at some point in his life that movement was something to be conserved and deployed only when it was worth deploying. Still like a man who had learned that you could understand more from a situation by watching it than by jumping into it. His eyes were gray. Thomas noticed his eyes first because they were looking at him with a quality of attention he was not accustomed to receiving from adults. Most adults, when they looked at a child in distress, looked with one of two expressions, pity or discomfort. This man looked at Thomas with something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing in the boy's face something he understood from his own experience and was taking careful account of. Thomas noticed his left hand second. The man's hands were hanging loose at his sides, the natural resting position of a man who did not fidget and did not make unnecessary gestures. His left hand rested against his leg, and on the fourth finger of that left hand, worn smooth and slightly misshapen from years of wear, was a gold ring. He was still wearing his wedding ring. Thomas did not understand why this detail struck him the way it did. He was 10 and could not have articulated the thing he was feeling, which was something like recognition, something like, here's a person who knows what it means to hold on to someone. But he felt it the way children feel things before they have language for them. In the chest, in the gut, in the quiet place behind the eyes where truth lives before it becomes words. The man stepped forward. The 6 men in the road parted for him without quite deciding to the way water parts for a stone. He stopped just inside the circle they had made around the woman and the boy. Please, Thomas said. He was looking straight at this man, now had not looked away since he first saw him. You have to tell them she's not dead. The man did not respond immediately. He looked at Thomas for another moment, that same careful and unhurried attention, and then he looked down at Clara Webb. He looked at her the way you look at something when you are actually looking at it, not just seeing it. He went down on one knee beside her. He did not ask anyone's permission. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply moved into position and placed two fingers against the side of her neck, just below the angle of her jaw, where the carotid artery runs closest to the surface. The road went quiet. Not quiet like before. Quiet in a different way, a waiting way, a way that made the cold morning air feel held in place. Thomas did not breathe. Warren Mills looked away. Pete Coker looked at his boots. The other men found various pieces of the horizon to study with great intensity. The man with the gray eyes and the worn wedding ring kept his fingers exactly where they were. His face did not change. He did not rush. He did not adjust his position impatiently. He waited with the stillness he had brought into the road with him, that absolute economy of movement, and waited for what he was looking for. 5 seconds, 10. Thomas's lungs were beginning to remind him of their existence. 15. And then something happened in the man's face. It was small. It would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching with the absolute and desperate attention that Thomas was bringing to it. A shift barely more than a rearrangement of intention in the muscles around the eyes. The quality of his focus changed from searching to found. "Wait," the man said. One word. Quiet. But the quality of it was different from anything Thomas had heard that morning. Not the tentative, wishful quality of someone guessing. The quality of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and is making absolutely certain before they say so. Warren Mills looked back. The man moved his fingers one small increment along Clara's neck. The adjustment of someone fine-tuning rather than starting over, and was still again. 1 second. 2. "She's warm," he said. "Body stay?" Pete Coker started. "No." The man did not raise his voice. He simply made the word final in a way that left no room. "This isn't residual warmth. There's a pulse. It's weak, but it's there." He lifted his fingers from her neck and sat back on his heel and looked at her and then looked at Thomas, and his expression had shifted into something that was not quite hope and not quite relief, but was something in that neighborhood, something that recognized what the bond had known all along. "She's alive," he said. The sound Thomas made was not the sound of a child who has gotten good news. It was the sound of a child who has been holding something impossible for an entire night, something too heavy for his size, and has just been given permission to put it down. It broke out of him in a single ragged exhale that was half sob and half breath, and he pressed his face back into his mother's shoulder and held on, but differently now. Not the holding of someone refusing to let go of the dead, the holding of someone who has just been confirmed in what they already knew. "Water," the man said. He was on his feet, already looking at the 6 men with an expression that communicated both urgency and calm. "Someone get water and a blanket, and if anyone in this town has medical training, find them. Now." No one moved for 3 full seconds. The word alive was still being processed, still being measured against what they had all believed to be true. "Now," the man said again. Not loud, just clear. Warren Mills moved first, then the others. Thomas lifted his face once more and looked at the man who had done this, who had kneeled down in the dirt and refused to take the world's word for it, and for a moment the two of them regarded each other in the middle of the road with the mist still sitting in the sagebrush around them and the pale October sky above. I told them," Thomas said. His voice was wrecked. "I told them she was still warm." The man looked at him for a moment. Something moved through his gray eyes, something private that Thomas could not name. "You were right," he said simply. He said it the way men say things when they mean them completely and see no need to say anything more. His name was Cole Hargrove. The people of Dustfall had been calling him Heavy Boot for 3 weeks, since the evening he led a gray dappled horse down the main road and into Margaret Sloane's stable without introducing himself to anyone. He paid for his room in silver coin, ate his meals alone at the corner table of Sloane's dining room, and had in 3 weeks spoken fewer words to the people of Dustfall than most men spoke before breakfast. No one knew where he had come from. No one had asked. There are certain men in whose company the natural human instinct to ask questions gets quietly overridden by a different instinct entirely, one older and more cautious one, that says whatever that man is carrying, whatever road brought him to this town, it is probably better for everyone if the asking waits until he is ready for it. Cole Hargrove was one of those men. What the people of Dustfall did not know, And what Thomas Webb, sitting in the October Road, would not know for some time yet was that Cole had been in Dustfall for 3 weeks for a reason. He had not drifted in on chance. He had arrived with a purpose that he carried the way he carried everything else quietly, without announcement, pressed close to the chest where it could not be seen but could not be left behind either. The purpose had a name. He had spent 3 years and several hundred miles making his slow way toward that name, and he had finally arrived in Dustfall, Wyoming in the first week of October, and for 3 weeks he had sat at the corner table and eaten his meals alone and watched a town that did not know it was being watched. He had been very careful. He had been very patient. And then a 10-year-old boy had refused to let go of his mother in the middle of a road, and Cole Hargrove had stopped walking. He had not planned to stop. He had simply stopped. Some things cannot be planned around. The gold ring on his left hand caught the morning light as he helped carry Clara Webb inside. Margaret Sloan had the door of the boarding house open before anyone knocked on it. This was not unusual for Margaret Sloan, who seemed to have an awareness of events in and around her establishment that bordered on the supernatural, but was in fact the product of 56 years of paying very close attention to the world around her and drawing correct conclusions from what she saw. She was a large woman, not fat, but solid in the way of people who have worked hard their whole lives and built themselves accordingly, with gray hair pulled back and a face that had been pretty once and was now better than pretty, the way faces get when the prettiness burns off and what remains is character. She had water already heating on the stove. She had clean cloth already on the table beside the bed in the room she had decided Clara Webb would occupy. She had a look on her face that said she had been expecting something like this, which was not quite true, but was close enough. Cole laid Clara on the bed. Thomas would not be separated from his mother's side. Margaret Sloan did not try to separate him. The three of them, the woman with the gray hair and the practical hands, the boy with the dark eyes and the night still on him, and Cole Hargrove with the worn wedding ring and the careful silence, worked together in that small room with the efficiency of people who understand that the time for words is later. Later, when Clara's breathing had steadied and the worst of the cold had been chased from her skin, when Thomas had finally slumped sideways in the chair beside the bed and closed his eyes against his will, Cole stepped out into the hallway. Margaret Sloan was waiting for him. She did not look like a woman who waited for things. She looked like a woman who made things happen and then stood in the place where they had happened and assessed the results. She had a cup of coffee in each hand, and she held one out to him. He took it. "Roy Castor did this," she said. Not a question. Cole looked at her over the rim of the cup. "The boy told me," he said, "him and another one, Hale Dunmore. They were asking about land papers." Margaret Sloan said it the way you say something you already knew before you said it. "She had papers when she came in. Land out at Brine Creek. I saw her showing them to old Willis at the land office the day after she arrived." Cole drank his coffee. 2 days later, Roy Castor showed up at her door, Margaret Sloan continued. "And now here we are." Cole looked at the closed door of Clara's room for a moment. "Who told Castor she had papers?" Margaret Sloan was quiet for exactly long enough to make the answer significant before she gave it. That she said is the right question. She looked at him with eyes that had seen a great deal and retained most of it. "Roy Castor doesn't make decisions," she said. "Roy Castor carries out decisions. You understand the difference?" "I understand. The man who makes the decisions in this valley will know about this morning before sunset." She paused. "He will know about you." Cole said nothing. "His name is Edmund Fitch," she said. He did not react, not visibly. But something happened in his eyes, something small and quick and controlled, a door closing on something that had been briefly visible. "I know," he said. Margaret Sloan studied him for a moment with the attention that had made her establishment the best-informed place in Dustfall for 3 decades. "Of course you do," she said. She took her coffee and went back downstairs without another word. Cole stood in the hallway for a while after she left. He drank his coffee and looked at nothing in particular and thought about several things, one of which was the closed door of Clara Webb's room, and another of which was a name he had been carrying for 3 years, and another of which was the expression on a 10-year-old boy's face when he had been told that the thing he already knew was true. Outside, Dustfall was waking up. This was a town of approximately 200 people, which was large enough to have several things a smaller town would not have, and small enough that everyone knew what everyone else was doing within about 4 hours of them doing it. It had a church, it had a jail, it had a boarding house, a general store, a blacksmith's operation, a small schoolhouse that was used irregularly, and a saloon that was used considerably more regularly. It had a sheriff's office with a sheriff in it who had a name George Alden and a title and a badge and very little else of substance. It had been this way for 4 years, though only some of the people of Dustfall knew exactly why. Cole had spent 3 weeks studying it from the corner table at Sloane's, and from the stable where his horse lived, and from the slow walks he took in the early morning before the town was fully awake. He had the skill of a man who has spent time as a lawman, the ability to read a community's internal weather by watching how people moved through it, where they looked and didn't look, how they greeted each other, and when they went quiet. Dustfall was a town that had learned to move quietly, not in the natural quiet of a small town that had found its rhythm, in the careful quiet of a town that had learned there were certain things you did not say too loudly, certain questions you did not ask, certain directions you did not look in for too long. The quiet of people who had made a series of small decisions to look away and had made these decisions so many times that looking away had become the natural thing, the unremarkable thing, the thing that required no thought. Cole had seen this before in other towns. He recognized it. He recognized, too, the specific way people in Dustfall did not mention the men who rode in from the north every 2 weeks or so, men on good horses with new guns and nothing to sell and nothing to buy, who stopped at certain places and left again. He recognized the way George Alden, the sheriff, moved through his own town, as if he were slightly apologizing for existing in it. He recognized the way the Reverend Eli Cross, who was 62 years old and the most respected man in Dustfall, and possibly the most unhappy, never held his gaze on anything for very long, as if sustained attention to any one thing might reveal something he preferred to keep obscured. He had been patient for 3 weeks. He had not moved yet because he had not yet found the thing he was looking for, the specific piece of evidence that would make what he knew into what he could prove. And then a woman from Kansas had arrived with a land deed and a son, and the balance of things had begun to shift. Thomas woke up around mid-morning to find his mother still breathing, and Cole Hargrove sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, reading a book that Margaret Sloane had apparently lent him. Thomas watched him for a moment before he registered being watched in return. "You stayed," Thomas said. "I stayed," Cole agreed. Thomas looked at his mother for a while the way children look at things they have been frightened of losing and are reassuring themselves are still present. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "You can ask." "What are you, I mean?" Thomas reconsidered. "What kind of man are you? Are you a lawman?" Cole set the book down on his knee. "Not anymore," he said. "Were you—" A pause. "Yes." "What happened?" Cole looked at him with that steady gray gaze. "That's a longer story than right now." Thomas accepted this with the practicality of a child who has learned that adults have their timelines, and pushing on them rarely helps. "Do you know who did this to my mother?" he asked instead. "I know the names of the men who came to your door last night," Cole said. "Roy Castor and Hale Dunmore. They work for a man named Edmund Fitch." Thomas was quiet. He was learning how to hold several things at once, which is one of the most important and most difficult things a person can learn, and he was learning it faster than most because he did not have the luxury of learning it slowly. "Thomas," Cole said. The boy looked at him. "Tell me exactly what happened last night, from the beginning." Thomas told him. It did not take long in the telling because it had not taken long in the happening. That was one of the terrible things about it. 2 years of traveling, of making do, of watching his mother solve problems with the contents of whatever they had in the wagon and whatever courage she had in reserve, which was considerable. 2 years of managing what life had handed them after his father, Edward Webb, had died of fever on the road west, leaving Clara with a boy, a wagon, a thin margin of money, and a document that referred to a piece of land in Wyoming that she had never seen. 2 years of getting here, of arriving in Dustfall 2 weeks ago, with that document in hand and a plan which was to file the deed and claim what belonged to them and make a life on it. And then Roy Castor and Hale Dunmore had knocked on the door. They had been polite. That was the detail Thomas kept returning to, the politeness. The way the larger one, Roy, had held his hat in his hands and spoken in a reasonable tone of voice, as if they were discussing a business matter and not standing in the doorway of a woman's rented room at night with their guns on their hips. He had asked about the deed. Clara had said she did not know what he was referring to. Roy had smiled at her. "Ma'am," he had said, "you picked the wrong week to arrive in Dustfall." They had come in after that. They had taken the money that Clara kept in the cloth bag inside the larger bag, which was not much, but was what there was, and they had taken the deed. When Clara had tried to take it back, Roy had put his hand on her shoulder and pushed. Not hard, not violent in any theatrical way, just sufficient. Clara had stumbled backward into the doorframe, and the sound her head made against the wood was the sound Thomas heard in his sleep for years afterward. She had gone down and had not gotten up. Roy and Hale had looked at her on the floor for a moment. Then Hale had said something to Roy in a low voice, and Roy had nodded, and they had left. Thomas had gone to his mother. He had put his ear to her chest. He had heard her heart. He had stayed there all night. In the morning, some of the men from town had come and found them in the road where Thomas had dragged himself and his mother, after some instinct told him that the room was not safe, that the open air was better, that he needed people around, even if those people did not yet understand what he needed from them. And they said they'd come back, Thomas said. Cole, who had been listening with complete stillness, looked at him. For the money, no. Thomas shook his head. For me. The room was quiet for a moment. Why for you? Thomas looked at his hands. He was 10 years old, and he had spent the night beside his unconscious mother and been awake long enough that exhaustion had passed through its first stage and come out the other side into something that felt like a strange clarity. Everything a little too bright and a little too precise. Because I heard them talking when they were leaving. Hale said something about how the boy was a problem. Roy said they'd come back and handle it. Cole nodded once. All right, he said. All right, what? Cole stood up from the chair and picked up the book and set it on the windowsill where it would be easy for someone to find later. All right, he said again, and his voice had the quality it had had in the road when he said now, when he said wait, the quality of a conclusion that had been reached and would not be revisited. Then they picked the wrong town. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. He had not yet decided whether to trust this man. He was 10 and he had learned something from the last 2 weeks about the gap between what people appeared to be and what they were, and he was careful now in a way he had not needed to be when his father was alive. But something about Cole Hargrove was difficult to distrust. Not because he was reassuring, he was not particularly reassuring, he did not have the manner of someone who was trying to make you feel better. But because he seemed to mean what he said without the hedges and softeners that adults used when they were not quite sure they could deliver on what they were promising. He noticed the wedding ring again. The man had not stopped wearing it. He wanted to ask about it. He did not yet know how. The woman who came first was Dorothy Alden, wife of the sheriff, and she came the way she always came to things in Dustfall, with a nod and a smile and a quiet and persistent presence that reminded Cole of water finding its way through rock. Not force, patience, and destination. She was 49, well-dressed for a town this size, with the kind of tidiness about her that is not vanity, but something more like discipline. She stood on the boardwalk across the street from Sloane's boarding house as Cole helped Warren Mills carry Claire inside, and she stood there with her arms crossed and her head tilted in the attitude of a person who is doing calculations. She did not come over. She did not offer to help. She spoke to the woman beside her in a voice pitched just low enough to require no effort to overhear if you were nearby and paying attention. Poor thing, she said, arrived 2 weeks ago, no family in the territory, no one really seems to know where she comes from. A brief pause precisely calibrated. And that boy of hers, he's been running through town at all hours. A child needs supervision, structure. Each of these observations was technically accurate. Not one of them was kind. They were designed not to be kind in any obvious way, but to accomplish something that kindness could not accomplish, which was to make the people around her begin to wonder, begin to calculate, begin to determine whether the trouble that had come with Clara Webb and her son was trouble they were obligated to take on. It was extremely well done. Thomas, who had come out to stand beside Cole for a moment, watched Dorothy Alden finish her work and drift down the boardwalk toward the general store with the unhurried movement of a person who has done what she came to do. She doesn't like us, he said. Cole looked at him. She doesn't know you, he said. Is that different? Cole thought about this for a moment with more genuine seriousness than most adults would have brought to a 10-year-old's question. Yes, he said. Quite different. Not liking someone you know is a conclusion. Not liking someone you don't know is a decision made in advance. The first might be justified. The second never is. Thomas considered this. Why does she do it then? Because something is at stake for her, Cole said. What exactly, I'm not yet sure, but people like that woman don't work this hard for nothing. There's something she's protecting. He was not wrong. He would find out exactly what in the hours to come. The sound came just before noon. Thomas heard it first because children hear things before adults do. The frequency of approaching hoofbeats, hitting something in his nervous system that had been tuned to it all morning, waiting, dreading, knowing it would come. He was on the porch of Sloane's when he heard it, sitting on the top step with his knees pulled up and his eyes on the north road, which was the direction they had come from the night before, and the direction he had been watching with the attention of a child who has learned that trouble comes from there. 3 horses, moving fast, then slowing as they reached the edge of town. Roy Castor came first. He was a large man in his mid-30s, with a face that had been made for working outdoors in a manner that had been made for things Cole did not want to think about with a 10-year-old nearby. Beside him was Hale Dunmore younger, with the specific restlessness of someone who has not yet figured out how to be still, always adjusting his grip on something, shifting his weight, finding ways to demonstrate that he was ready for action, even when no action was required. Behind them was a man Thomas had not seen the night before, large and quiet, whose name was Bill Greaves, and whose skill in the world was the same as Roy's, which was doing what he was told without asking questions about it. They saw Thomas. Roy Castor's mouth made a shape that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. "Well," he said, "looks like you didn't run." Thomas did not move from the step. His instinct was to run. His instinct was very clear about this. But something else, something that had been growing in him all night beside his mother, held him where he was. Something that had decided without consulting, fear that this was the step and he was on it, and that was where he was going to remain. Cole came out of the building behind him. He did not come fast. He came with that same economy of motion that had characterized everything he had done since he appeared in the road that morning, with the quality of a man who conserves movement for when it means something. He stepped off the porch and moved past Thomas and stopped in the road between the boy and the 3 horses. He put his hands at his sides. "You're done here," he said. Roy Castor looked him over. It was the look of a man who has made a habit of assessing people and does it quickly and with some confidence in his results. "Step aside, friend. We've got business with the boy." "No," Cole said. "Not you have no business here. Not I suggest you reconsider." Just the word placed in the space between them like something solid. Roy's expression shifted. He looked at Hale, then at Greaves, then back at Cole. "You're making a serious mistake," he said. "You know who sent us." "Edmund Fitch," Cole said. "I know." Something happened in Roy Castor's face when Cole said that name. A recalibration. The name was supposed to end conversations in this town. It had been ending conversations in this town for 4 years. The fact that Cole Hargrove had said it and remained standing in the road without any visible change in his posture or his expression indicated something Roy Castor had not encountered before in Dustfall. "Then you know what happens to people who—" Roy's hand moved toward his gun. What happened next was something that several people in Dustfall described afterward with the same imprecision, because the human eye is not built for the speed at which it occurred. Cole's right hand moved, and then Roy's gun was not in Roy's hand anymore. It was in the road. The sound of the shot, which came from Cole's weapon, arrived in the ears of the witnesses, a fraction of a second after the gun had already landed in the dirt. And by the time Roy understood what had happened, he was cradling his right hand against his chest, and the weapon was 10 feet away, and Cole Hargrove had not moved his feet at all. Hale and Bill Greaves did not move. Cole stood with his gun drawn and his eyes on all 3 men at once, in that precise and unhurried way, not sweeping his gaze between them, but holding a point of focus that somehow included all of them. "Next one who reaches," he said, "doesn't keep the hand." The road was very quiet. Several people had come out of various doors and storefronts to see what the gunshot was. Warren Mills was among them. Henry Pratt the blacksmith, a large and capable man who had been one of the 6 in the road that morning, was among them. Margaret Sloane stood in the doorway of her building with a look on her face that said she was cataloging what she was seeing for later use. Roy Castor picked up his gun with his left hand. His right hand was not seriously damaged. The shot had been placed to remove the weapon from his grasp rather than to do lasting harm, which required a level of precision that made the figurative room go somewhat quiet in the minds of everyone watching. Roy looked at Cole with a different expression now. The assessment was complete, and it had produced a result Roy had not expected. "Edmund Fitch is going to hear about you," he said. Cole did not respond. Roy looked past him at Thomas, still sitting on the step, watching with his dark eyes and his still face. "He'll want to know your name," Roy said. "Then tell him Cole Hargrove said hello," Cole said. Roy Castor's face changed again. One more recalibration, one more piece of information going into the calculation, changing its result. He turned his horse. He did not say anything else. He and Hale and Bill Greaves rode back the way they had come north, back toward whatever waited for them up, there taking the name Cole Hargrove with them, like something they had not expected to be carrying. The people of Dustfall watched them go. Thomas got up from the step. He came and stood beside Cole, who had put his gun away, a thing done and completed requiring no further attention. "Thank you," Thomas said. Cole looked at him. He looked for a moment at the north road where the dust the three horses had raised was still settling. "Don't thank me yet," he said, not because he doubted what he had done. He did not doubt it. But because he knew in the way of a man who has been watching a town for 3 weeks and has just thrown his first stone into its still water that the ripples had only just begun to move. Roy Castor was going north to report, and what came back from the north would not be 3 men on horses. Thomas stood beside him in the afternoon light, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Behind them, through the thin walls of the boarding house, Clara Webb continued the slow and determined work of coming back. She was still warm. That was what mattered. That was what had started all of it. The afternoon came in cold and stayed that way. Cole Hargrove stood at the window of the small room that Margaret Sloane had given him on the second floor of her boarding house and watched Dustfall go about the business of a town that had just witnessed something it was not quite sure how to process. People moved differently than they had that morning. There was a quality to the movement, to the way men crossed the street, and women gathered at the edges of storefronts and spoke to one another in voices kept just below carrying distance, that Cole recognized from other towns and other times. A community that has just seen a stone thrown into water, it had carefully kept still, watching the circles move outward and wondering how far they will go. He had seen it before. He knew how it tended to go. Margaret Sloane came up the stairs at 4 in the afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and a directness of manner that communicated she had not come to make small talk and would appreciate it if he did not attempt any. She set 1 cup on the windowsill beside him and kept the other for herself, and stood at the other window and looked out at the town she had spent most of her adult life learning. "Roy Castor has been in Dustfall twice in the last month," she said. "Before that, once every 2 weeks. Regular as the mail." Cole drank his coffee. "He comes from the north. There's a property up at Brine Creek," she said. "Ballston used to belong to a family named Harlan. They were persuaded to sell it about 4 years ago. Edmund Fitch bought it, and whatever is up there now, it isn't ranching." Cole looked at her. "You've known that for 4 years." It was not an accusation. The tone was entirely neutral. The tone of a man stating a fact and waiting to see what the person he is stating it to does with it. Margaret Sloane did not flinch. She had not survived 56 years in the American West by being the kind of woman who flinched at accurately stated facts. "What I know and what I can do about it are 2 different categories," she said. "George Alden is the sheriff of Dustfall. The law in this county belongs to him. And for 4 years, George Alden has been doing precisely what Edmund Fitch pays him to do, which is nothing." Cole nodded slowly. "And the Reverend Eli Cross," she said. "He's been here almost as long as I have. He was a good man once." She paused, and in the pause was the weight of someone describing a thing they wish were different. "He is perhaps still a good man somewhere underneath everything that has been added to him in the last several years. But a good man who has been making bad choices for long enough begins to have trouble telling which is which. He witnesses documents," Cole said. "Deed transfers. He puts his name on papers, and people trust the papers because they trust the name." She looked at her coffee. "Or trusted it. There are people in this town who have signed things they believed were fair agreements and may not yet have realized they were not." Cole thought about this for a moment. "Dorothy Alden," he said. Margaret Sloane set her cup down on the windowsill with the care of someone placing a decision exactly where it belongs. Dorothy has a gift, she said carefully, for knowing things before she should know them. Who has arrived in town, what they are carrying, what business they have come to conduct. She looked at him. Clara Webb showed her land papers to the man at the land office 2 days after she arrived. Willis is a quiet man and a discreet one. He would not have told anyone what he saw. But someone else was watching, Cole said. Someone is always watching in Dustfall, Margaret said. And what is seen gets to Edmund Fitch through whatever channel is most efficient. She picked up her cup again, finished what was in it, and went back downstairs with the quiet authority of a woman who has said what she came to say and trusts the listener to do something useful with it. Cole stood at the window for a while longer. Below, Dorothy Alden was crossing the street toward the general store. She moved with the certainty of someone who knows where she stands in the architecture of a place and trusts that architecture to hold. She paused at the door of Whitmore's store to speak with two women who were leaving it, and in the brief and apparently friendly exchange, Cole could see even at this distance the thing he had identified that morning. The slight tilt of the head, the considered pause before certain sentences, the quality of a person who is not merely passing on information, but arranging it. He had spent 3 weeks watching Dustfall, and he had seen this woman operate in it, and he had categorized her correctly on his second day in town. But what he had not yet fully understood was how central she was to the mechanism. Not the engine of it, Fitch was the engine, but something essential to how the engine ran. A gear that turned other gears. A conduit between the visible and invisible workings of a thing that required both to function. He thought about Clara Webb in the room at the end of the hall, still unconscious, still breathing, still determinedly occupying the space between the two conditions that had been proposed for her that morning. He thought about Thomas on the step. He thought about a piece of land at Brine Creek and a deed and a name he had not yet heard connected to any of this, but that he suspected with the instinct of a man who has been looking for the shape of a thing long enough to recognize its outline, when he sees it was going to matter very much before this was over. The next morning he went to see Henry Pratt. The blacksmith shop was at the east end of the main road, a structure that was more honest than beautiful, which suited the work done in it. Henry Pratt himself was more honest than beautiful in much the same way. He was 41 years old, built like something load-bearing with forearms that suggested a life of work that most men would have declined if given the choice in hands that had been shaped by hammer and iron into something close to tools in themselves. He had a wife and two boys, 7 and 9, and he had been one of the 6 men in the road that morning, and he was working now with the focused intensity of a man who is trying to keep his mind on what is in front of him and away from what it keeps returning to. He looked up when Cole came in and did not stop working. Cole let him work for a while. He stood near the door and watched the process with what appeared to be idle attention and was in fact the same careful attention he brought to everything. And after several minutes, Henry Pratt set down what he was working on and looked at his visitor with the direct assessment of a man who has spent his life dealing with things as they are, rather than as he might prefer them to be. "I saw what happened yesterday," Henry said, "with Roy Castor." "Most of the town did," Cole said. Henry wiped his hands on the cloth that hung at his belt. "You're not from here." "No. You're not passing through either." It was not a question. People who are passing through don't get sideways with Roy Castor and then stay for coffee. "No," Cole agreed, "I'm not passing through." Henry Pratt looked at him for a long moment and then made a decision that was visible in the slight squaring of his shoulders, the adjustment of a man who has decided to receive information he is not sure he wants. "Then say what you came to say." Cole said it plainly and without any of the framing that might have made it easier to hear, because he had learned that framing tended to create distance between people and the facts they needed to deal with, and distance right now was not something he could afford. He told Henry Pratt what Clara Webb had been carrying when she came to Dustfall. He told him what it meant that Fitch's men had taken it. He told him what he had spent 3 weeks learning about the way this town worked, the circuit that ran from Fitch to Cross to Alden to Dorothy Alden and back again, a closed system that had been running without interference for 4 years, because interference required someone to start it, and no one had started it yet. Henry Pratt listened. He listened the way a man listens when he is not listening for a reason to respond, but for a reason to believe. When Cole finished, Henry was quiet for a moment. "I have a wife," he said. "2 boys." "I know." Fitch holds the note on this shop. Henry looked at his hands. Bought the debt from the bank in Cheyenne 2 years ago. He has never called it in, but he has never let me forget that he could. Cole nodded. That's why he does it with paper first, Cole said. Not with guns, with arrangements and documents and debts that sit quietly until they're needed. By the time anyone understands what has been built around them, the structure is already load-bearing. Henry Pratt looked up at him. So what are you asking me to do? Nothing yet, Cole said. I'm asking you to know the whole picture, that's all. Right now, that's all. Henry Pratt held his gaze for a long moment. And later? Later depends on what happens next, Cole said. He left the blacksmith shop and walked back through Dustfall with the morning light coming in at a low angle across the buildings. And he thought about what he had just done, which was to begin something that could not easily be undone. And he thought about whether it was the right thing to begin, and he concluded, as he had concluded when he stopped in the road the morning before, that there are moments in which the question of rightness is somewhat beside the point, because the alternative to acting is simply another kind of action, one with its own consequences that must also be weighed. He had been weighing them for 3 years. It was time to stop weighing. That evening, when Thomas was asleep in the chair beside his mother's bed, and the boarding house had gone quiet around them, Margaret Sloane came to the porch with 2 cups, and Cole came and sat across from her. And for a time, they did nothing but watch the road and listen to the silence of a town that has gone carefully to sleep. You didn't come here by accident, Margaret said. No. You came here for Fitch. Cole looked at the road. Yes. She waited. This was one of Margaret Sloane's considerable gifts. She could wait without filling the waiting with sound, which is rarer than it ought to be, and more valuable than people recognize. Cole drank his coffee and looked at the dark road and thought about what to say and how much of it to say, and concluded that she had already earned the truth by 3 weeks of saying nothing about his presence in her establishment that could have been said and choosing to say it to no one. 3 years ago, he said, I was a deputy marshal in Crail County, Nebraska. He said it the way you say a thing that is still present tense somewhere inside you, even when all the external facts have moved on. There are former lives that remain current in this way. The names we carry from them do not quite fit the past tense, no matter how far the clock has moved. I started looking into Edmund Fitch, he said. He was operating in Nebraska the same way he operates here. Land arrangements that weren't what they appeared. Documents processed through offices, arranged to process them without asking the right questions. A network of people who knew or half knew or chose not to fully know, and who found their silence compensated in ways that made continued silence comfortable. Margaret Sloane said nothing. I had been at it 6 months, Cole said. I was getting close to something. Not close enough to prove it, but close enough that Fitch knew I was close. He paused. My wife's name was Martha. The road sat in its dark silence. She was at our place when it burned, Cole said. I was in town. By the time I got back, it had been going long enough that there was nothing left to go back to. He stopped there because that was where the facts stopped being facts and started being something else, something that lived below the level of language in the same region where Thomas's refusal to move had lived in the same region where Clara's heart had kept going all night against the cold and the weight of everything arrayed against it. I lost the job, he said. No proof. Couldn't prove the fire was set. They said I'd become too personally involved in the investigation to be objective. He looked at his left hand at the ring. They weren't wrong. I had. And you've been looking for him since then, Margaret said. I've been looking for the proof I didn't have then, Cole said. There's a difference. Is there? He thought about it honestly. It was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer. I'm not always sure, he said. But I came here for what can be proven, not for what I want done. There's something in Dustfall, something that connects what Fitch did in Nebraska to what he's doing here. I can feel the shape of it. I just haven't found the piece that makes it whole. Margaret Sloane was quiet for a long time after that. That boy's mother, she said finally. She arrived with papers. Yes. There's a reason those papers were worth taking, she said. And I don't think it's only about Brine Creek. Cole looked at her. No, he said. I don't think so either. He did not yet know how right they both were. Morning came again, and with it a piece of paper that changed the shape of everything. Thomas found it while going through his mother's bag, looking for nothing in particular, the aimless rummaging of a child who needs to do something with his hands while he waits for the thing he cannot hurry. It was tucked into the lining sewn into a seam with the careful concealment that suggested whoever had hidden it there had thought about it, had wanted it to be in a place that would survive a casual search. It was not the deed. The deed was gone, taken by Roy Castor. This was something else, a copy of part of the deed written out by hand in his father's particular upright script, the kind of handwriting that people of Edward Webb's generation learned in schoolhouses that insisted on it. His father had been a careful man, a precise man. He had apparently understood when he made his copy of that deed and sewed it into the lining of his wife's traveling bag that the original might one day need a backup. Thomas brought it to Cole. Cole took it and read it, and the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. He read it again. The document was partial, a transcription of the original land grant for the parcel at Brine Creek in the valley north of Dustfall. The land had been granted under federal homestead provisions in 1873. The name of the original grantee, written in Thomas's father's careful hand, was listed at the top of the document. Martha and Cole Hargrove. Thomas watched Cole's face while he read it. He had learned to read faces the way you learn to read weather in open country by necessity, by the understanding that what is written in a person's expression is often the most accurate available forecast of what is coming. Cole's face was, as always, extremely controlled. But control is not the same as absence, and Thomas was close enough and attentive enough to see the thing that passed through those gray eyes when they reached the name at the top of the page. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. The quality of a wound being confirmed rather than inflicted. "Do you know that name?" Thomas asked carefully. "Martha Hargrove." Cole's hands were absolutely still on the paper. "She was my wife," he said. The room received this. Thomas received it. He looked at the paper and looked at Cole and held the several pieces of what he now knew and tried to arrange them into a shape he could understand. "Then this land was yours first," he said. "Yes." "And Fitch took it?" "Yes." "And my father bought it without knowing it wasn't Fitch's to sell?" "Yes." Thomas looked at his mother's still face on the pillow. "So when Mama came here with her papers," he said slowly, following the logic with the methodical care of a child who has learned that facts need to be followed to where they actually go, she was carrying a proof that the land was never legally Fitch's, that the whole transfer was fraudulent. "That's what this says," Cole confirmed. "That's why they took the deed." "Yes. And that's why they came to our room." Cole set the document down on the bedside table with the care of something being treated as the evidence, which is exactly what it was. "Your father was a careful man," he said. "He always said paper was the only thing that lasted," Thomas said. He looked at his mother again. He wasn't wrong. He folded his hands in his lap and sat with the information that his mother had nearly been killed for carrying a document that proved a dead woman's land had been stolen, and that the man sitting across from him had loved that dead woman, and that all of them were connected to each other and to this piece of ground in the valley north of town by a chain of events that had been set in motion years before any of them had arrived in Dustfall. And he sat with this in the stillness of someone who is doing the interior work of arranging a very large thing into a place where it can be carried. "You need to tell her," he said finally, "when she wakes up." Cole looked at him. "Yes," he said, "I do. She'll want to know." Thomas looked up. "She always wants to know the real thing, even when it's hard. She says not knowing is worse than knowing because what you don't know, you can't deal with." Cole was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like a practical woman," he said. "She's the most practical person I know," Thomas said. And there was in his voice, underneath the exhaustion and the weight of the last 2 days, the unmistakable quality of pride. That afternoon, while Thomas sat with his mother, Cole observed the thing he had half expected to observe. Dorothy Alden's day had a shape to it, and he had learned the shape over 3 weeks of watching. She rose early and moved through the social geography of Dustfall with a purpose that looked like nothing more than the ordinary commerce of a woman who knows her community and cares for it, stopping here and there, a word at the general store, a visit to one of the church women, a pause at the edge of the road to speak with whoever was passing. It was a perfectly natural pattern. It was also, Cole had come to understand, a collection and distribution network as efficient as any he had encountered. What he had not yet confirmed was where the information ultimately went. On this particular afternoon, he confirmed it. Dorothy Alden went to the house of Reverend Eli Cross at 5 in the afternoon. She was there for 12 minutes. When she came out, she had the expression of a woman who has completed a task rather than conducted a social visit. She walked back toward her own home without stopping anywhere along the way, which was unusual because she always stopped somewhere along the way. 40 minutes later, Roy Castor appeared at the edge of town on the North Road. He did not come in. He stopped at the point where the road turned behind a stand of cottonwoods and was mostly obscured from the main street, and someone came out to meet him on foot. Cole, who was positioned in a way that required some forethought, could see the shape of the meeting without hearing its content. The person who walked out to meet Roy Castor on the North Road at 6 in the evening was Reverend Eli Cross. They spoke for perhaps 3 minutes. A small object passed between them, something the size of a folded letter. Roy Castor put it in his coat. He turned his horse and rode north. Cross walked back toward town with his eyes on the ground, his hands behind his back, the posture of a man doing his thinking in the open air. Cole watched him walk all the way back to his house and go inside. He stood for a while after and thought about what this meant. He had known at some general level that Cross was part of the mechanism. He had suspected Dorothy Alden's role, but seeing the circuit complete itself in this way in real time, with the actual physical transmission of information moving between the layers of the structure, brought the whole architecture into sharp and useful focus. There were 3 pillars. Edmund Fitch held the economic power. George Alden held the legal apparatus, or the appearance of it. And the connection between the respectable surface of dustfall and the machinery beneath it ran through 2 people. Dorothy Alden, who gathered, and Eli Cross, who transmitted. Remove the connection and the other pillars had no information. Expose the connection and the other pillars had no cover. He was still working through the implications of this when Margaret Sloane came to find him. "She's awake," she said. He followed her upstairs. Clara Webb was sitting up in the bed when he came in, which was not what he had expected and probably should have been. She had the color back in her face, not much, but some, and her eyes were open and fully present in the way that eyes sometimes are after a long period of unconsciousness, unusually clear and direct, as if the rest had stripped away whatever usually stood between a person and the direct expression of their interior state. She looked at him when he came through the door and did not look away. Thomas was in the chair at her side, and his face, when he looked at his mother, had in it all the things he had been holding for 2 days compressed into an expression that was trying very hard to be calm and was mostly succeeding. "Mr. Hargrove," Clara said. Her voice was rougher than he expected it to be, but there was something entirely clear in the center of it, a quality of directness that he recognized immediately as the source of the quality he had seen in her son. "You should rest," he said. "I've been unconscious for 2 days," she said. "That's different from resting. Sit down, please." He sat. She looked at him for a moment in the assessing way, the way of someone who is doing the work of reading a person and taking it seriously. "Thomas told me what you did," she said. "Both things, finding me and standing in the road." Cole said nothing. "He also told me that Roy Castor and Hale Dunmore work for a man named Fitch." "Yes." "And that this man apparently has substantial control over this town." "Yes." "Which raises the question," she said in the tone of a woman who has been thinking, even while unconscious, of why a man with that kind of power would send 2 men to take a land deed from a woman he had never met. Cole looked at her. "Because the deed proves something he does not want proven," he said. "What does it prove?" he told her. He showed her the copy that her husband had sewn into the lining of her bag, and he watched her read it, and he watched her arrive at the same name Thomas had arrived at, and he told her before she could ask what he had already told Thomas. She was quiet for a long time after. The room had gotten dark while they talked, and Margaret Sloane had come in at some point and lit the lamp without anyone asking her to, because she was that kind of woman, and now the lamplight sat in the room with them and made everything amber and close. "I am sorry," Clara said finally, "about Martha." The words were simple, and she said them simply, and there was nothing in them that was performance or courtesy. They were exactly what they were. "It was 3 years ago," he said. "3 years is not long," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him across the small distance of the room, and he looked back, and something was exchanged that was not words and could not have been words, the specific recognition of one person who knows what loss is for another person who knows the same thing, the small and insufficient nod of acknowledgement that is all either of them has to offer, and that is in its smallness more honest than anything larger would have been. "I need to know something," Clara said. She said it with the directness she had been demonstrating throughout this conversation, the quality her son had in abundance and had clearly not acquired from nowhere. "Are Thomas and I part of your plan to reach Fitch? Or did we become a reason that changed the plan?" He thought about how to answer this honestly. "The morning I stopped in the road," he said, "I was not thinking about Fitch. I was thinking about a boy who would not let go." She looked at him. "And now? Now I am thinking about a woman who nearly got buried alive because she was carrying a paper with my dead wife's name on it," he said. "And I am also thinking that the reason I came to this town is still here and still unfinished, and that you and your son are now part of it, whether any of us intended that." "That doesn't answer my question." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She looked at him for a moment with something that was more serious than a smile, the expression of a person who has heard the truth and is recognizing it by the way it doesn't quite fit comfortably. "You're not lying to me," she said. "That matters." "I figure you've heard enough lies shaped to be comfortable," he said. "Too many," she said. The lamp made its small circle of warmth, and they sat in it for a while, and the conversation moved into simpler things, the practical things, the "what happens tomorrow?" and "what do we know and what do we need?" questions. But underneath those questions, the shape of what had just been established remained. Not an agreement exactly, not a promise. Something quieter and more durable than both of those things, the thing that exists between people who have decided without quite saying so to stand on the same ground. Then Clara said something he had not expected. "3 nights before Roy Castor came to our room," she said, "I couldn't sleep. I walked out toward the stable at the edge of town, Cross's stable. I saw 2 men inside. One of them I recognized the next morning when I passed him on the street. It was Roy Castor. The other I did not know." She looked at her hands. "There was a third man with them. He had his back to me the whole time. He was giving instructions. And when Roy handed him something, a rolled paper, the kind that holds documents, he turned just enough for me to see his profile." The room was very still. "I didn't know who he was," Clara said. "I didn't know what I had seen. I only understood it when Fitch walked into this dining room 2 nights ago and I heard his voice. I would know that voice anywhere. And I can describe exactly what I saw in enough detail that a judge would know it is not something I invented." This was why Roy Castor had come the wrong week. Not only for the deed, Clara had seen something she should not have seen in a place she should not have been at an hour when Cross's stable should have been empty. She had been carrying 2 pieces of evidence without knowing she was carrying either of them. "The deed was not the only thing I was carrying," she said. "It was the only thing Roy Castor knew to take." Cole sat very still for a long moment. "You're a witness," he said. "Yes." "To Fitch, directly. To his presence at a transaction that Cross can explain under oath." She looked at him. "Combined with everything you find in that box, it closes the circle." Thomas sat in his chair and watched the 2 adults in the room arrive at the same understanding from different directions. "I'm going to stand in that street," Clara said. "Not because I am unafraid, I'm afraid. I am very much afraid. But because I did not come all this way to stop at the last part, though." She looked at Cole with the directness she had been demonstrating since she opened her eyes. "You don't need to protect me from my own decisions, Mr. Hargrove." "I know," Cole said. But you can stand next to them," she said. She said it the way he had said it the night before, giving the words back to him in the quieter form of an agreement rather than an offer. "Yes," he said, "I can." Thomas in his chair allowed himself something that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. He left her room and went down the hall to his own and sat in the dark for a while. He thought about the ring on his left hand. He looked at it in the darkness, where it was invisible, where it was just a weight and a warmth and a shape he had memorized so thoroughly that it required no light. He thought about Martha. He thought about carrying the specific and heavy knowledge that she was gone because of something he had done and something he had not done in time. He thought about whether what he was doing now was justice or vengeance, and whether, as Thomas had said with his mother's words in his mouth, he could tell the difference. He thought about a 10-year-old boy lying across his mother's body in a road and refusing to accept the world's version of events. He thought about the courage of that refusal. He was still thinking about it when the sound came from downstairs. The sound of the door, and then the voice of Margaret Sloane saying something in a tone she did not usually use, and then a different voice, entirely smooth and unhurried, and carrying with it the quality of someone who has never needed to raise their voice because the alternative to compliance has always been obvious enough. Cole got up. He was downstairs before the second sentence had finished. Edmund Fitch was sitting at the corner table of Margaret Sloane's dining room. Not Cole's usual corner, the other one. Sitting there with his hat on the table beside him and a cup of coffee that he had apparently requested and received, which said something about the nature of power in this town that needed no further analysis. He was 45 years old, as well-groomed as a man could be after a day's ride with gray at his temples and the kind of suit that announced quietly and without ostentation that the person wearing it could afford considerably better than this, and had chosen this specifically because it read as reasonable rather than extravagant. His hands wrapped around the coffee cup were a gentleman's hands. His eyes, which found Cole the moment Cole came down the last step, were something else entirely. 3 other men had come with him. They were positioned around the room in the way of professionals, which is to say without appearing to be positioned at all. The people of Dustfall who happened to be in Sloane's dining room that evening did not get up and leave immediately. They stayed in the way that people stay when they are frightened and uncertain and trying to understand what is happening, and their staying meant that everything said in that room in the next several minutes would be heard and processed and distributed through the town by morning. Fitch knew that. He had arranged it that way. Cole Hargrove, Fitch said. He said the name with no particular emphasis in the tone of a man who has long since made his peace with whatever feelings the name might have previously generated in him. 3 years. I thought you were dead. Cole came and stood at the edge of the room. He did not sit. He did not accept the implicit invitation to be at the same level as the man at the table. Still here, he said. Fitch looked at him for a moment, and then with the timing of a man who has rehearsed this without appearing to have rehearsed it, turned his attention to the room at large. This is a man I know, he said to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. We had some dealings in Nebraska 3 years ago. He was a deputy marshal at the time. He paused. He became very interested in investigating me, based on, I should say, almost no evidence of any actual wrongdoing. This investigation occupied him so completely that it began to affect his judgment, his relationships, his capacity to do his job objectively. Cole stood at the edge of the room and said nothing. His wife died in a fire, Fitch said. A terrible accident. He was convinced with no evidence that I was responsible. This conviction became something close to an obsession. His supervisors eventually had to remove him from his position. Not because he was wrong about me, you understand, but because a man that personally invested cannot be trusted to distinguish between what he believes and what he can prove. He said all of this in the tone of someone presenting a case study, a cautionary tale, something educational. After that, he drifted, Fitch said, for 3 years. And now he is in your town, standing in your streets, involved in the affairs of people he has just met. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it. The question I would put to you, he said, is not who I am or what I represent. You know what I represent. The question is who he is, what he wants, and whether what he wants has anything to do with you or whether you are simply the most convenient available situation. He set the cup down. Warren Mills was at a table near the wall. Henry Pratt had come in from the street sometime during this and was standing near the back with his large and capable hands at his sides. Margaret Sloane was behind the counter. Thomas had appeared at the top of the stairs at some point and was sitting very still on the top step in the shadows where he was difficult to see. Cole did not speak. He did not speak because a portion of what Fitch had said was accurate and he was not willing to compound what had already been done by lying about it, and he was not yet ready to give the complete truth in a room arranged by Fitch for Fitch's purposes. So he said nothing, and his silence in the room Fitch had arranged did exactly what Fitch had intended it to do. People looked at him, and in looking at him and in seeing his silence began to do the arithmetic Fitch had set up for them to do. Henry Pratt looked at the floor. Warren Mills looked at the wall. The other men in the room found various things to look at that were not Cole or Fitch. Fitch stood. I'm not a difficult man to deal with, he said, and the room heard this for the threat. It was while registering it as the reasonable statement it was structured to resemble. Mr. Hargrove is free to leave Dustfall tonight. There's no need for any of this to continue. The woman and the boy will be left in peace. He put on his hat. But if he stays, he said. And now he was looking directly at Cole, and the quality of the look was the quality of something final and entirely serious. Whatever happens next is his responsibility. He walked out, his 3 men went with him. The room sat in the particular silence of people who have just been rearranged, who have felt the furniture of their understanding moved into a configuration they had not chosen and do not entirely like, but are not sure how to return to its previous position. One man got up and put his coins on the table and left without looking at Cole. Then another, then a third. Henry Pratt stood for a moment at the back of the room, looking at Cole with an expression Cole could not fully read. Then he too went out into the street. Warren Mills was the last to go. He looked at Cole as he passed, and there was something in the look that was not hostility and not accusation, but was in the neighborhood of both the look of a man who has just been made uncertain about something he thought he was certain of, and is not pleased about the uncertainty. Cole stood where he was. At the top of the stairs in the shadows, Thomas sat very still. He had heard everything. He had watched everything. He was 10 years old and had been awake for most of the last 3 days and had just watched a room full of people decide in real time and with minimal pressure to choose not to trust the only person who had done anything to help his mother. He sat and thought about this for a while, and then he did something that neither Cole nor Edmund Fitch had anticipated, because no one ever anticipated the specific initiatives of a 10-year-old boy who has decided that the situation requires him to act. He put on his coat and went out through the side door of the boarding house and walked through the dark streets of Dustfall to the house of Reverend Eli Cross. The light was on. Thomas stood outside the window for a moment, long enough to see the interior. The table with its papers and documents, the lamp at one end, and against the far wall the map. He had seen it before. He had looked through this same window on an earlier night when he could not sleep, and had wandered and had found himself here. But he understood more of it now than he had then. The colored markings, the names on the parcels, the pattern that, now that he knew what to look for, was not subtle at all. He knocked on the door. Reverend Eli Cross opened it and looked down at the boy on his step for a long moment without speaking. "I saw your map," Thomas said. "I know what it shows, and I know what happened at your stable 3 nights before Roy Castor came to our room. I was looking for my mother that night. I saw you there too." He said this last part without being entirely certain it was true. He said it because he had seen enough and understood enough to know that it was probably true. And because sometimes the only way to find out if you are right about something is to act as if you are and see what the other person does. Eli Cross looked at him for a long, long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. His voice when he said it had the quality of something that had been held in place by great effort for a very long time and had just been let go. He had been there. He had witnessed Fitch directing Roy Castor at the stable exchange. He had known what the rolled papers contained. He had done nothing. And he had been living with the knowledge that a woman had nearly died in part because of what he had said nothing about. He sat Thomas down and told him about the copies. Every deed transfer, every property arrangement, every land agreement that had passed through his office over the previous 6 years. Not the originals were wherever Fitch kept them. But copies made carefully and completely over the course of 6 years by a man who did not entirely understand why he was making them, but understood at some level below the conscious that someday someone would need them. The box was under the floorboards. Cross lifted the boards himself slowly, with hands that trembled in the way of someone setting down something heavy after carrying it too long. "I kept these because I knew the day would come," he said, his voice low. "I did not stop it when I should have. I could not undo it, but I could make sure there was a record." He looked at Thomas. "Give this to Mr. Hargrove." He paused. "Tell him I am sorry. He will know what it means." Cole was still downstairs when Thomas came back an hour later with a wooden box tucked under his arm. He set it on the table in front of Cole and opened it and did not say anything while Cole looked at what was inside. Cole looked at the documents for a while. "He gave you these," he said. "He said to tell you he was sorry," Thomas said. "He said you'd know what it meant." Cole closed the box. He sat with his hands flat on the top of it and his eyes on the middle distance, where the thing he had been building toward for 3 years had just taken one large and definitive step toward completion. Tomorrow Edmund Fitch would come back with more men. Cole understood this with the certainty of a man who knows how the next move in a particular game is always the same regardless of who is playing it, because the game has a logic and the logic does not change. Tomorrow this town would have to decide what it was. Tonight he had a box full of evidence and the knowledge that a 62-year-old man of God who had been carrying the weight of a wrong thing for too long had finally set it down. He sat with his hands on the box and thought about Martha and thought about Thomas on the step and thought about Clara's voice saying 3 years is not long, and he thought about the choice that was now in front of him, which was not really a choice at all, but simply the thing that came next in a sequence he had set in motion a long time ago on a night when a house burned down and he drove his horse home through the dark and got there too late. He thought about justice and vengeance and whether he could tell the difference. He thought he could. He thought that what was in the box was the difference. Outside, Dustfall slept in its careful way, in the practiced quiet of a town that had learned to keep its lights low. But something was different in that quiet now. Something had shifted in the balance of things, the way weight shifts when one element in a structure changes its position and the whole arrangement has to find a new way to hold. By morning, it would begin to be visible. By afternoon, it would be impossible to ignore. And Edmund Fitch, who was somewhere north of town in the property at Brine Creek that had once belonged to a woman named Martha Hargrove, would ride in with 14 men and find that Dustfall was no longer entirely what it had been the day before. He would not be the only one who noticed. The morning came in without ceremony. That was the thing about mornings in Wyoming in October. They did not ease you into the day. They arrived with the cold already established, and the light already making its demands, and the absolute indifference of a landscape that had been here long before anyone had decided to build a town on it and would be here long after. The sagebrush did not care what had happened the night before. The sky did not adjust its color for the convenience of people who had not slept well. Cole was on the porch when Thomas came down. He had been there since before the light, sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold sometime in the last hour, watching the North Road in the dark, and then watching it in the gray, and then watching it in the pale gold of early morning. Not because he expected anyone on it yet, because watching the North Road was at this moment in the sequence of events the closest thing to useful that he could do while he waited for the next thing to become clear. Thomas sat down on the step. He did not say good morning. He was a child who had learned that social ceremonies were for people who had the time for them, and he did not currently have the time. They sat together for a while in the way they had been learning to sit together, which was without the pressure to fill the silence that adults often felt, and that Thomas had never particularly felt, and that Cole had trained himself out of long ago. "Is it true," Thomas said finally, "what Fitch said last night, that your wife died because of you?" Cole looked at the North Road. "Martha died because Fitch ordered it," he said. "But I moved before I was ready, and that gave him a reason to act when he did. Those are two different things. They both happened. That's not the same as it being your fault." "No, but it's not entirely not my fault either." Thomas turned this over in the careful interior workshop where he processed things. "So you came here for revenge," he said. "I came here for what can be proven," Cole said. "I came here for the document that would make what I know into something a judge can act on. Whether that's the same as revenge or different from it is something I have not always been certain of." "My mother says," Thomas said with the quality of a child who is about to deliver something that was given to him by someone else and has proven itself useful, "that justice is what you want for someone else. Revenge is what you want for yourself." Cole looked at him. The morning light was coming in fully now, crossing the boards of the porch and reaching the step where Thomas sat, making the boy's dark eyes catch a quality of amber that had not been there in the dark. "Your mother," Cole said, "is smarter than most people I have met." "I know," Thomas said, in the simple tone of someone confirming a fact that requires no embellishment. "Then, are you leaving?" Cole looked at the North Road for a moment longer. Then he picked up his cold coffee and stood up and looked at the door of the boarding house. "I need to pay a visit to the sheriff's office," he said. Thomas looked up at him. "That doesn't answer my question." "No," Cole said, "it doesn't." He went inside. Thomas watched the door for a moment after it closed. Then he looked at the North Road himself with the patient watching that did not require anything to happen in order to be useful. He thought about what his mother had said many times and in many situations about the difference between safe and right. He thought about the ball of documents on the table inside. He thought about Reverend Cross, who had looked when Thomas left him the night before like a man who had set down something he had been carrying for so long that the putting down of it had made him unsure of his own balance. He thought about what came next, and he decided that he already knew. Cole found George Alden in the alley behind the jail. This was not a dramatic discovery. George Alden was not hiding. He was simply standing in the alley with a cup of coffee of his own in the shadow of the building, doing the thing he had apparently been doing for several years, which was existing in a space that was neither here nor there, neither inside the building that held his office, nor outside in the town he was supposed to be serving. Alden saw him coming and did not run. He was 52 years old and had not been the kind of man who ran from things even before he had become the kind of man who had things worth running from. He was simply tired. This was the quality that Cole had noticed in him from the beginning and that had distinguished him from the other functionaries of Fitch's arrangement. Roy Castor was not tired. Hale Dunmore was not tired. They had the energy of men who had made their peace with what they did and derived from it something close to satisfaction. George Alden had not made his peace. He had simply stopped fighting. "He's coming today," Cole said without preamble. Alden looked at his coffee. "I know. With more men than yesterday. A lot more." "I know that too." Cole looked at him for a moment. "How long?" he said. Alden knew what he was asking. 4 years, he said, give or take. What was it worth? Alden's jaw worked for a moment. This was not a question anyone had asked him before, not in those words, not with that directness, and the directness of it reached something in him that the more accusatory approaches he had imagined in his own private accounting had not. "More than it was worth," he said. Cole nodded. "What changed?" he said. Alden was quiet for a long moment. In the distance, somewhere on the main road, a door opened and closed. The town was beginning its morning. "My wife's nephew has a boy," Alden said. 3 years old. I saw a picture of him on Dorothy's mantelpiece last week." He looked at the alley wall. "I thought about what kind of town this boy was going to grow up in. And I thought about the kind of man I had spent 4 years helping to build it." Cole waited. "He's bringing 14, Alden said. "Not 3. They'll come in the afternoon when the light is good and the street is visible and everyone can see." He looked up. "Fitch likes a visible demonstration. He's done it in other towns. It ends the same way." "Not this time," Cole said. Alden looked at him with the expression of a man who wants to believe something and is not yet sure he has the right. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Stand on the street when they ride in," Cole said. "Uniform, badge, in the right place." Alden blinked. "That's all." "That's everything," Cole said. "Sometimes all a town needs to remember what it is to see the law standing where it's supposed to stand. You don't have to do anything except be there and be visible and be honest about what you are." He paused. "Can you do that?" George Alden looked at the alley wall for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." Cole left him there and went back to the boarding house. Clara was awake when he got back. She was sitting up in the bed and she was looking at the door when he opened it with the expression of a woman who has been doing a great deal of thinking and has arrived at conclusions. Thomas was in the chair beside her. He had apparently briefed her on the morning because the information already visible in her eyes suggested she was working with a more complete picture than she had possessed the night before. "Fitch is coming this afternoon," Cole said. "I know," Clara said. "Thomas told me." She looked at him. Her voice was still rough at the edges, still carrying the evidence of what had happened to her, but the center of it was entirely clear, entirely her. "I'm going to stand in that street," she said. "I know," Cole said. "Thomas," Clara said, "what did I always tell you?" "Safe and right are different things," Thomas said, "and you have to know which one you're choosing." "And today I'm choosing right," she said. "So," she looked at Cole, "tell me what we need to do." They went house to house through the morning. It was Cole who carried the box. It was Clara who did most of the talking because Clara Webb was, it turned out, someone that people listened to not because she was loud or theatrical or because she used the voice designed to move people. She was listened to because she was precise and because she was honest and because there was about her even now, with the evidence of what had been done to her still visible in the careful way she moved, an absolute refusal to present herself as a victim. She presented facts. She laid documents on tables. She let people do the arithmetic themselves and reach their own conclusions. Margaret Sloan did not need any of it. She was at the door of her establishment, going When Cole and Clara came down the front steps together, and she looked at them for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is now watching it happen. "The Garfield family," she said. "The Whitmores. 3 others I can name." She was already untying her apron. "They will listen to me. I have known them longer than they have known themselves." She looked at Clara. "You all right to be on your feet?" "Yes," Clara said. Margaret looked at her for another moment, the assessing look, the inventory. "Good," she said. "Then let's not waste the morning." She went right. Cole and Clara went left. They found Henry Pratt first. He was in his shop working with the focused intensity of a man who was trying to outpace his own thinking. When Cole set the box on the anvil and opened it, Henry set down his hammer and did not pick it up again. He went through the documents with the methodical attention of a man who works with precise tolerances and understands the importance of verifying measurements before you commit to an irreversible action. He stopped at a particular page. He read it twice. "This is the original grant for my shop," he said. His voice was careful in the way of someone who is working very hard to remain calm about something they are not calm about. "The date on this document, the note that Fitch says I owe him, he acquired that note after this date, which means he bought a debt on a property that this document shows was never properly transferred to the previous owner who sold it." He looked up. "He fabricated the debt." "Yes," Cole said. Henry Pratt put the document down on the anvil beside his hammer. He looked at the hammer. He looked at the document. He looked at Cole, then at Clara, then at Clara's face, which still showed what Roy Castor's hands had done to her 2 nights ago, and he held that for a moment. "What time," he said, "do they get here?" Dorothy Alden was at her usual post. She was in front of the general store when Cole and Clara and Thomas came down the main road toward it in the spot she occupied most mornings at this hour with the posture and expression of someone who is exactly where she expects to be and expects everyone else to understand this. She saw them coming. Her expression went through several things in rapid succession, none of which were visible to anyone who was not watching very closely, and Cole was watching very closely, and what he saw was calculation, then recalculation, then the smooth professional recomposure of a woman who has spent decades making her interior visible only when she chooses. She put on the expression she used for situations requiring managed concern. "Clara," she said as they drew level with her, "you should not be on your feet, after what you've been through." "Mrs. Alden," Margaret Sloane said. Margaret had come down from the other direction, completing an angle that was not quite an encirclement, but communicated clearly and without theater that this particular conversation had already been accounted for in the planning. Dorothy Alden looked at Margaret with something shifting behind her eyes. "2 weeks ago," Margaret said in the same tone she used to tell guests what was on the breakfast menu, completely matter-of-fact, entirely without drama. "Clara Webb showed her land papers to old Willis at the land office. The only person present besides Willis was you. You were passing as you often pass. Willis is a quiet man and told no one." 2 days later, Roy Castor came to Clara's room. She looked at Dorothy Alden with the clear and unblinking gaze of a woman who has been in this town for a very long time and has been waiting a very long time to say a very specific set of words. The documents in that box proved that what Clara was carrying showed Fitch's entire arrangement to be fraudulent. You knew what those papers were when you saw them. And you told Cross, and Cross told Roy Castor, and a woman nearly died. The 2 women who had been standing with Dorothy Alden took a step back. It was not a dramatic step. It was the quiet, involuntary step of people who are adjusting their proximity to match their revised understanding of a situation. Dorothy Alden opened her mouth. She was in her way a gifted woman. She had managed the social architecture of this town for 4 years, with a skill that deserved, had it been applied to anything legitimate, considerable respect. She had words available. She had framing available. She had the practiced instruments of a person who had spent a long time learning how to shape the interpretation of events. But the box was open on the table of the general store which they had passed, and whose door stood open, and the documents were visible, and the names on those documents were the names of families who had lived in Dustfall for years, and several of those family members were within earshot, and the women who had taken that small step back were among them. The instruments of narrative management require above all else an audience that does not yet know what it knows. Dorothy Alden looked at the faces around her and understood that this particular audience had passed that point. She looked at Clara Webb. Clara Webb looked back. There was nothing theatrical in the look. Clara did not manufacture triumph or satisfaction for it. She was a woman who had nearly been buried alive 2 days ago and was now standing in a street on legs that were not entirely steady, and she looked at Dorothy Alden with nothing in her face except the clean and uncomplicated expression of someone who has survived something and is simply present on the other side of it. Dorothy Alden went inside the general store. She closed the door behind her. The women who had been standing with her did not follow. Not vindictiveness, not triumph. Simply the adjustment of a community that has restructured its understanding of itself and is making the necessary spatial accommodations. The afternoon came in on schedule, indifferent to what had happened in the morning. The North Road was visible from the porch of Sloane's boarding house, which was where Cole was standing when the dust appeared. Thomas was beside him. Clara was in the doorway behind them, having conceded after some negotiation that she would start from the doorway and move to the street when it became necessary and not before. The dust revolved into horses. 14 of them, as Alden had said, moving in the formation of men who have done this before in other places and know how it goes. Fitch at the front, Roy Castor at his right, his hand wrapped from the day before. Hale Dunmore. 9 others whose names Cole did not know and whose purposes he did not need to know. The street was not empty. This was not what Fitch had arranged for, and his recognition of the fact was visible in the slight checking of his horse as they entered the main road, and he processed what was in front of him. Margaret Sloane stood at the door of her establishment. Henry Pratt stood in front of his shop with his large hands at his sides. Amos Whitmore had come out of his general store and was standing beside it. The Garfield brothers, who farmed land north of town, that appeared in the box as one of the earliest fraudulent transfers, were standing together near the livery. George Alden stood in the middle of the road in his uniform and his badge in the position of a man who has decided where he is going to stand and has planted himself accordingly. Fitch brought his horse to a stop. He looked at the street and looked at Alden and looked at Cole on the porch and managed in the way of a very controlled man not to show what this assessment was producing in him. "Mrs. Webb," he said, identifying Clara in the doorway, "you've recovered." "Completely," Clara said. "You should be resting." "I saw something 3 nights ago," Clara said, and her voice carried in the afternoon air with a clarity that the street received and kept. "At Reverend Cross's stable. I saw you there, Mr. Fitch. I saw what you passed to Roy Castor. I saw your face when you turned." She stepped forward from the doorway onto the porch. "I will say exactly what I saw in front of every judge in Wyoming. I will say it today, and I will say it next month, and I will say it in 10 years if necessary." She looked at Fitch directly. "The documents that explain what I saw that are currently in the possession of people in this town, and copies have been sent to the circuit court in Cheyenne." This last part was not entirely true yet, but it would be true by tomorrow morning because Margaret Sloane had already addressed an envelope, and truth, as Clara had learned, sometimes needed to be treated as present tense in order to become so. Fitch looked at her. Then he looked at Cross, who had come to the door of his house at the edge of the street and was standing there in the afternoon light with the posture of a man who has set something down and is now standing straight for the first time in a long time. Cross nodded. It was a small nod. It was one of the most consequential nods in the recent history of Dustfall. Fitch looked back at the street. He looked at the assembled people, the ones who had chosen to stand in it, and he did the calculation that such a man always does in such a moment. Numbers, odds, variables. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, and the tone was still managed, still controlled, but something in its foundations had shifted. Henry Pratt spoke. "I read the original deed for my property this morning," he said. His voice was the voice of a large man who was being extremely careful with his volume, which is to say that it carried anyway. "The debt you hold on my shop was created after the original grant was filed, which makes it fraudulent." He paused. "I think most of the people standing in this street this afternoon have read something similar about something they thought they owned." The acknowledgments that came from various points along the street were not loud. They were quiet in the way of people who are saying something they have been holding for a while and are now saying carefully. But they carried. Fitch turned to Cole on the porch. "Hargrove," he said. Cole stepped down from the porch to the street. It was a small movement. It changed the geometry of the situation in ways that were felt before they were seen. Whatever you think this accomplishes, Fitch said. It accomplishes what it accomplishes, Cole said. You don't need me to explain it to you. You can't prove anything that will hold. I can prove everything in that box, Cole said. And the woman on that porch can testify to what she saw at Cross's show's stable. And the Reverend can testify to what he witnessed and what he certified over 6 years. He looked at Fitch steadily. That's 3 sources in front of a federal judge. You know what that means. Fitch looked at him for a long moment. The controlled quality of his expression, the absolute management of surface, while the interior ran its calculations, was still present. It was still functioning, but something underneath it had changed the way the ground changes when something essential to its structure has been removed. He looked at Roy Castor. He looked at his 14 men ranged behind him on the street. He looked at George Alden standing in the road in his uniform. He looked at the people of Dustfall who had come out of their buildings, in their habits, in their long practice of looking away, and were standing in the afternoon light of a Thursday in October, looking back. And that was when Thomas yelled. He yelled one word the way you yell when there is no time for more than one word, when everything in your body has resolved itself into a single urgent signal, and the only question is whether it arrives in time. Cole moved. He had trained himself over years of work in which the difference between moving and not moving was the difference between consequences that could be recovered from and consequences that could not, to move in response to certain sounds before the brain had finished processing them. The specific quality of Thomas's voice went into him below the level of thought and produced motion. He was not fast enough to avoid it entirely. The shot came from the roof of the storage building on the east side of the street, from a position that had been arranged in advance, which was why Fitch had wanted the afternoon light, which made the street bright and the rooftops dark. Cole had accounted for most of the visible threats. He had not accounted for the man on the roof because you cannot account for what you cannot see, and the man on the roof had been there since before noon. The bullet hit Cole's left shoulder and turned him sideways and put him down on one knee. The street erupted, not into flight. The people of Dustfall who had chosen to stand in that street in that afternoon did not scatter. They moved some of them forward and some of them to the sides for better angles, but they did not run. And this was something that Fitch had not predicted because it had not happened before. It had not happened before because before there had always been enough fear to produce the necessary dispersal, and the fear was still present today, but it was no longer sufficient because something had been added to the street that outweighed it. Henry Pratt did not run. Margaret Sloan did not run. George Alden drew his weapon. He drew it with the practiced motion of a man who had been doing this for 30 years before the 4 years during which he had not been doing it properly, and the practice was still in his hands even if it had been absent from his judgment, and he fired a warning shot into the sky above the street with the voice of a man reclaiming a register he had let go dormant. Edmund Fitch, his voice carried to the end of the road and beyond. You are under arrest for the murder of Martha Hargrove, for the fraudulent transfer of land in Brine Creek Valley, for extortion and intimidation of residents of Dustfall. Put your weapons down. The street received this. Fitch's 14 men looked at their employer. They were professional men in the way that people who do this kind of work are professional. They were not cowards and they were not without resources. But they were also men who made calculations, in the calculation of 14 against a street full of people who were not running, backed by a box of documents already described as copies sent to the circuit court, backed by a woman who would testify to a judge about what she had seen at Cross's stable was a calculation that produced a different result than the one Fitch had arranged for this afternoon. Roy Castor, whose hand was still wrapped from the day before, looked at Hale Dunmore. Hale Dunmore looked at the rooftop. The man on the rooftop, who had apparently not anticipated the shouting child and the moving target, was reassessing his position. Fitch looked at Cole. Cole had gotten back to his feet. His left side was not working entirely correctly, and there was blood making its way down his arm, but he was on his feet, and his right hand was at his side, and his eyes were on Fitch, with the unhurried quality of attention that had been there since the first morning in the road. Fitch stepped down from his horse. He did it the way Cole had known he would, in the way of a man who understands that the confrontations that truly matter are the ones that happen between two people and not between their respective armies. Because armies can be counted and calculated, and the final number can be made to come out differently than you want it to, but a confrontation between two people is about something that numbers cannot fully account for. He walked toward Cole. Cole watched him come. It was always personal for you, Fitch said quietly enough that only Cole could hear. 3 years. Martha. All of this. He looked at Cole's left shoulder and did not look troubled by what he saw there. Killing me doesn't bring her back. No, Cole said, it doesn't. And you know you can't prove a direct connection between me and that fire. Your witness saw someone at the stable. That's all she saw. That's enough, Cole said, with the documents, with Cross's testimony, with the pattern of how you operate in every town you've operated in, documented in that box going back 6 years. He looked at Fitch steadily. It's enough for a federal judge. You know it is. Fitch stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at Cole in the way of a man taking a final inventory, checking the last available angles for the last available options. And what exactly do you think happens after? He said. You have a history. I've made sure of that. A disgraced deputy with a personal vendetta. Whatever you put in front of a judge, I can put something in front of the same judge about you. Yes, Cole said. You probably can. He reached into the inside of his coat. What he brought out was not his gun. It was a set of iron cuffs, the kind a marshal carries worn smooth from years in a coat pocket taken out of the drawer of his rented room at Sloane's boarding house that morning, and put in his coat because he had known, when he put them there, that he would need them. He held them up between himself and Fitch so that both of them and the street behind them could see what they were. Martha wouldn't want me to shoot you, Cole said. That's not something I can prove to anyone's satisfaction, and it's not something I expect you to care about. But I know it, and knowing it is the reason you are going to leave this street in iron instead of in the ground. Fitch looked at the cuffs. He looked at Cole's face. He had spent a great many years reading faces, and he read this one correctly, which was to say, he read in it the absolute absence of performance. What Cole Hargrove was saying, he was saying because he meant it, and what he meant he would do because he had decided to do it, and the deciding in this man was as close to irreversible as anything Fitch had encountered. Behind Fitch, one of his men put a gun down on the road. The sound of it was specific and definitive. The sound of iron on packed dirt, the sound of a decision made. Then another. Fitch stood and looked at the man in front of him, and the street behind him, and the people of Dustfall standing in the afternoon light, and completed his calculation. He held out his wrists. Cole put the cuffs on him. It took perhaps 3 seconds. When it was done, Cole stepped back, and Fitch stood in the middle of the street in iron and looked at the town that had decided with his 14 men behind him and his 3 pillars around him to become something different than it had been the day before. It was over. For a moment, the street held it. The moment that follows a long and complicated sequence of events, when the sequence has reached its conclusion and the air does not quite know what to do with the absence of what was building in it. Henry Pratt exhaled. It was a long and total exhale, the sound of a man releasing something he has been holding at considerable physical cost, and it was followed by a smaller sound from the direction of the Garfield brothers, and a sound from Margaret Sloane that was not a word, but carried the weight of many words. And then the street began the work of returning to itself. George Alden supervised the disarming of Fitch's men with the efficiency of a man who has remembered what he knows. He moved through the process with a competence that was visible and unhidden, the competence of someone who had always had it and was now applying it again after a long interruption. Roy Castor and Hale Dunmore did not resist. Roy Castor looked at the end of it like a man who had been doing arithmetic for several minutes and had arrived at a sum that did not surprise him but that he had hoped might come out differently. The man on the roof came down. He came down because Cole told him to, and because the street below made the alternative unappealing. He was a young man, younger than anyone had expected, with the look of someone who had taken a job without fully reading the terms. The evening came in slowly, the way evenings come in after days that have used up most of what the available hours had in them. The light went gold and then amber, and then the deep blue of a Wyoming dusk that is not yet dark but has made its intentions clear. Thomas sat on the porch of the boarding house and watched the town move. It moved differently than it had that morning. He had seen Dustfall in the morning, quiet and in the tense middle of the day, and now he was seeing it in the aftermath of something, and what he was seeing was something he did not have a word for yet, but would eventually understand to be relief, finding its shape in bodies that had been holding something for a long time. People moved more slowly. People stopped to speak to each other and did not look over their shoulders while they were speaking. Lights came on in windows earlier than usual, as if the darkness were less urgent to keep out. Henry Pratt stood in front of his shop for a while with his hands at his sides, looking at the sign above the door that bore his name, and then he went inside and his wife came out and stood where he had been standing and looked at the same sign with a different expression. Margaret Sloane had coffee on for anyone who came. People came. Reverend Eli Cross sat at his kitchen table and wrote. He wrote for several hours. He was writing a confession, complete and detailed, covering 6 years and more specific than anyone had asked him to be, because he had decided that if he was going to set down the weight he had been carrying, he was going to set down all of it, every piece, and leave nothing in his pockets for later. George Alden wrote his own account at his desk in the sheriff's office. He wrote it in his official capacity using the forms he had not used for their proper purpose in 4 years, and he wrote himself into it as both witness and participant in the illegal arrangements because he had told Cole he was going to, and he was, it turned out, still a man who kept the things he told people he would do. Dorothy Alden did not come out of her house that evening. This was noted and not remarked upon. There was in the way the town of Dustfall did not remark upon it a kind of judgment that was more complete than anything more visible would have been. Not vindictiveness, not triumph. Simply the adjustment of a community that has restructured its understanding of itself and is making the necessary accommodations. Dorothy Alden was not gone. She lived there. She would continue to live there. But the position she had occupied in the architecture of the town had been vacated, and the vacancy was noted, and the town would determine in its own time and its own way what would be built in that space. Cole was on the boarding house porch when Clara came out. She was moving carefully with the measured deliberateness of someone whose body is reminding her at every step of what it has been through, but she was moving, and the way she moved communicated that the care was tactical rather than fearful. She sat in the chair beside the door and looked at the town in its evening state and did not say anything for a while. Cole had his shoulder wrapped. Margaret had attended to it with the pragmatic efficiency she brought to everything, and it was not as serious as the amount of blood had suggested being high, and outside the joint, the kind of wound that hurts considerably and heals completely if it is properly managed. He sat with his right arm resting on the porch rail and his left arm still, and watched the last of the light go out of the squamum. Thomas is asleep, Clara said. Good. He's been awake for most of 3 days. So have you. She looked at the street. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would, she said. How did you think it would feel? She considered this. Larger, she said. More finished, like the end of a chapter where you can feel the edge of the page. It is finished, Cole said. Fitch is in the jail. Alden has sent for the circuit judge. Cross has written out everything he knows. The documents are going to Cheyenne. He looked at the street. It's done. Then why doesn't it feel that way? Cole thought about this for a moment. Because done doesn't mean repaired, he said. The thing that was built here over 4 years doesn't disappear because the man who built it is in irons. The people have to figure out how to be something different than what they practiced being. That takes time. He paused. It's still done. It just doesn't look like the end of a chapter. It looks like the beginning of the next one. Clara looked at him. And for you, she said, what does it look like for you? He thought about Martha. He thought about 3 years and several hundred miles and the slow and persistent weight of something unfinished. He thought about the morning in the road and a boy who would not let go and the cold coming up through the October ground. He looked at his left hand. The ring was still there. It would stay there. It was not something to be taken off. It was not something to be resolved or reconciled or set aside. It was simply part of him. The way the lines around his eyes were part of him, and the gray at his temples was part of him, worked into the fabric of his existence by enough time that removing it would require removing something essential to the structure. But the weight of it was different tonight. Not lighter, different. The difference between carrying something that is unfinished and carrying something that has been brought to its conclusion. Martha's death was not finished, would never be finished, was not the kind of thing that admitted of finishing. But what had been left undone in its aftermath was done now. The account, as completely as it could be balanced, had been balanced. For me, he said, it looks like Cheyenne. I have to go to the circuit court and submit my own testimony and account for 3 years of conducting an unofficial investigation that stepped outside the boundaries of my authority. The judge will have questions. I have answers. He paused. After that, Clara wired. After that, he said, I haven't decided. Thomas mentioned a fence, she said, on the north side of the property. He mentioned it to me as well. And a barn roof. Yes. He appears to have developed a property assessment. He appears to have, Cole said. She looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that was not asking him anything, which was paradoxically asking him everything, the kind of openness that is harder to maintain than a direct question, and that honest people practice when they want an honest answer rather than a performed one. I don't have an answer yet, he said. That's the truth of it. I have Cheyenne. I have a circuit court and a judge and whatever comes out of that. I can tell you what I intend after Cheyenne. He stopped. But I won't tell you what I intend and then not be there to do it. So what I'll tell you tonight is that there's a fence on the north side of a piece of land in Brine Creek Valley that has your name and a dead woman's name on the deed, and that deed is going to be cleared through the federal court as part of this proceeding, and after that, the land will belong to you and your son. That's not what I was asking, Clara said. I know, he said, but it's what I can promise tonight. She looked at him for a long and considering moment. That's enough, she said, for tonight. She went back inside. He sat on the porch. The night had come in completely. Now the sky above dustfall going to its deep October black, the stars arriving with the abundance of high country nights, too many to count, more than anyone had ever counted. Somewhere in the buildings around him, dustfall was doing the quiet work of a town, becoming itself again, finding its way back to whatever it had been before it lost its nerve, renegotiating the terms on which its people related to one another, and to the things they had allowed and the things they had refused to allow. The lamp in Clara's window stayed on for a long time. He watched it without deciding to watch it the way you watch things that are simply present and that your attention returns to without being directed. He thought about Martha. He thought about her in the way he had been learning in the last 2 years of the 3 to think about her. Not in the register of loss, which is consuming and which had occupied him for the first year almost entirely. Not in the register of guilt, which had occupied much of the second, but in the register of the actual person, the specific and unrepeatable individual who had worked in her garden in the summer and taught children to read in the winter and had hands like Clara's hands worked and capable, and who had loved him in the imperfect and completely real way of people who have decided to do that with their lives and whom he had loved back in the same way. She would have known what to do with this situation. She had always known what to do with situations he was still working out the shape of. It had been one of the things about her. He thought she would have told him to go to Cheyenne and come back. He thought she would have meant it. The morning when it came with cold and light and the absolute indifference it always brought the sagebrush, making no adjustments, the sky maintaining its opinions. Thomas was on the step. Cole came down and stood beside him, and they looked at the north road together, which had been the direction of trouble for several days and was now simply a road. You're going to Cheyenne, Thomas said. Yes. Today. This morning, the sooner I go, the sooner it's done. Thomas looked at the road. How long? Depends on the judge, Cole said. A week, maybe 2. Thomas nodded. He was doing the thing he had been doing since the first morning, the thing Cole had recognized in him, and that had been one of the first reasons he had stopped in that road. The holding of difficult things at the level they required, not inflating them into drama, not deflating them into nothing, just holding them at their actual size and carrying them accordingly. When you come back, Thomas said, not if the fence on the north side needs to be started before the ground freezes any harder. The ground is already hard. There's still time. How do you know? Thomas looked up at him. Because I've been watching the ground since we got here, he said. It's not fully frozen yet. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3. If you're back in a week. Cole looked at him. You've been watching the ground. I watch things, Thomas said. You taught me that. Or maybe I already knew it and you showed me what it was for. Cole said nothing for a moment. The corner room, he said, and Mama already said to save it. Did she? Yes, she said it before you got up. Cole looked at the north road, at the place where the dust had been 3 days ago and was still this morning, at the long line of it going up and over the rise and disappearing into the country beyond, which was wet and cold and indifferent in the way that Cole had spent most of his adult life moving through, and that had never quite felt like something to move toward until now. He went to the stable and got his horse. He checked the cinch and the saddlebags and the condition of the animal, which had been well kept in Margaret Sloane's stable and was ready for travel. He checked the contents of the saddlebags twice, which was habit and not anxiety. He was buckling the second saddlebag when he heard the step behind him. He did not turn immediately. He finished what he was doing, then turned. Clara was standing at the stable door in the morning light. She had a cup of coffee and she held it out to him, and the gesture was so simple and so practical and so entirely devoid of any of the performance that surrounds significant moments in the stories people tell about them, that it struck him in the very simplicity of it as one of the most articulate things he had seen in a very long time. He took the cup. She looked at the horse, at the saddlebags. "Cheyenne," she said. "Yes. Be careful on the North Road. Always." She looked at him for a moment with the clear and direct expression he had come to associate with her, the expression that meant she was seeing what was there rather than what she had decided to see. "There's coffee every morning," she said, "when you come back." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the saddlebag he had just buckled. He unbuckled it. He took out the extra weight he had put in that morning, the things a man carries when he is not sure how long he will be gone, and he set them on the stable shelf. He did it slowly and with consideration, each item placed deliberately the way you place things when you are arranging them to be found later, rather than carried now. He rebuckled the bag, he put his foot in the stirrup and swung up. Thomas was at the stable door now, having appeared in the way that Thomas appeared at things without transition, simply present when the moment called for it. Cole looked at them both. "A week," he said, "maybe 10 days. Thomas nodded, Clara nodded. He rode out of the stable and onto the street and turned north, which was the direction of Cheyenne and the circuit court and the judge and the accounting that needed to happen before anything else could. Behind him, Dustfall was waking up in the changed air of a town that had found its way back to itself. The light was coming in low and gold across the buildings, the same light that had come in 3 mornings ago when a boy refused to let go of his mother in a road, and the sagebrush was doing what the sagebrush did, which was nothing, and the sky above was the pale and indifferent blue of a Wyoming October morning. He rode north without looking back, not because he didn't want to, because he was coming back, and a man who is coming back does not need to look back. He carries what he's returning to inside him, where it doesn't require a direction. He reached the rise where the road turned and the town fell away behind him, and he kept riding steady and unhurried, the horse moving with the rhythm of a well-rested animal on familiar terrain. In the boarding house behind him, Thomas Webb stood in the doorway and watched the dust settle on the North Road and did not look troubled by it. His mother came and stood beside him. They stood there together in the morning light the way they had stood beside each other in every difficult moment of the last several years, which was simply beside each other without the need to make it into anything more than what it was. "He'll be back," Thomas said. "Yes," Clara said, "before the ground freezes." "Yes." Thomas looked at the road. "I told you," he said, "that first morning." She was still warm. Clara put her hand on his shoulder. "You did," she said. "You were right. I knew I was right. I know you did." They stood there for a while in the doorway, with the morning coming in around them and the road empty and the town of Dustfall making its slow and determined way back toward whatever it was going to be next. Sometimes what saves a life is a boy who will not let go. Sometimes what saves a man is watching him do it. And sometimes the thing that saves a town is nothing more or less than someone deciding in a cold October road that the world's version of events is not the only version available, and that the difference between those versions is worth standing in. The ground was still warm. It always had been.